Good morning, everybody. 3 articles from 2016, January 2016, just after Making a Murderer came out. These are 3 articles from the Washington Post, from the In Theory opinion column. Article number 1, I shall leave the links below, of course. Article number 1, headline. Journalists are supposed to protect the innocent, but it's easy to fail. This article from Janelle Ross, who is a reporter for the Washington Post's The Fix. At the start of any job, it's best to understand not just the rules, but also the purpose they serve. Years ago, my guide in the work of covering alleged crimes was a plain-spoken Texan who owned a ranch, played a guitar, and often arrived in the newsroom clad in cowboy boots. His instructions often sounded like a solemn, slowly dispatched code about the difficult working of writing about crime. What he had to say: in Texas, accusations of the most serious crimes could, in fact, lead to death. Reporters had an utter obligation to relay what police and prosecutors said happened, make the source of that narrative clear, contemplate and insert a variety of language identifying that which was unproven, uncertain or unclear. That language should remain until the reporter's own work, real, get the facts reporting, could justify its removal. This, he said, is how the presumption of innocence was conveyed to the public and how a philosophical but essential concept in American criminal justice is made real. The media rank among the most powerful checks against the march toward the wrong conclusion, and perhaps to reinforce the gravity of this work. He also strongly recommended that every reporter witness at least once an execution carried out by the state of Texas. That really wasn't unreasonable. Stories about crime, along with logs of activity in City Hall, school board disputes and storms, rank among the most read contents of any local paper. A bigger national version of the same is true of almost every television news program. And because of this, the details of the most awful tragedies that befall families each year or alter the lives of individual crime victims also represent a kind of entertainment. These stories are a source of intrigue. They can amount to cautionary tales, putting a reporter's work on the front page of a newspaper for days or even months on end. They can transform local reporters, police, and prosecutors into major players on far bigger stages. There are temptations for reporters and for the media as a whole to move past the get the facts and admit what is unclear stage and to adopt law enforcement's voice of certainty all too soon. If reporters simply let the important work go, they suddenly have all the time in the world to track down grieving and stunned family members on either side of a crime's human equation and to provide the sordid details that keep readers interested. As journalists begin to work for an increasing number of outlets on television or online, the pressure to unearth new facts grounded in reporting has not kept pace with the drive for lurid detail. And quite frankly, even the journalists who maintain sufficient skepticism and attempt to seek the facts may still do the accused, the victim, and the public a disservice. Journalists are not immune to the many variants of conscious and unconscious bias. We can try to be conscious of the ways in which we do or don't have in common with our subjects, skews our understanding of the truth. And we can lean on the discerning eye of an editor with biases of their own. This is work that, when taken seriously, is very hard, but is also very important. As Netflix's Making a Murderer so clearly conveys, any reported story built solely from unexamined information that some might say is spoon-fed by police and prosecutors almost always becomes complicit in advancing not the presumption of innocence, but of guilt. While there is much that the documentary does not answer, there is an uncomfortably large volume of critical and messy detail the filmmakers make no attempt to integrate into the series. The story does leave viewers with an unsettling conclusion. Though Stephen Avery, the twice convicted man at the centre of this series, may not be one of them, people can be wrongfully convicted in this country. It seems that this happens most often because of who they are and what they do not have. That is the humbling truth about how our system works. Moving on, item number 2. Why do prosecutors go after innocent people? This is by John Pfaff. John Pfaff is a professor of law at the Fordham University School of Law in New York City. His research focuses on explaining the causes of mass incarceration, especially the central role prosecutors have played in the process. When people think about how our criminal justice system tries to avoid convicting innocent people, they probably think of the second half hour of a Law and Order episode. Defence attorneys making motions to thwart the prosecutor, jurors furrowing their brows as they wonder whether the state really has met the high standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. But that's not reality. In real life, once a prosecutor decides to file felony charges against a defendant, that defendant will almost certainly be convicted, and local prosecutors have a strong incentive to file, thanks in no small part to electoral pressures. A study of the Bureau of Justice Statistics looking at urban defendants in state courts found that in 2009, 66% of those charged with felonies were convicted, while only 1% were acquitted. The vast majority of those convicted pled guilty instead of going to trial. This means that the last real chance to avoid a wrongful conviction actually occurs at the screening stage, when the prosecutor decides whether to file charges in the first place. And screening is an important part of the process. That same Bureau of Justice Statistics report found that over a third of all cases were dismissed, diverted, or deferred, with almost all of those being dismissed. We'd like to think that the high conviction rate reflects really good screening, that prosecutors file charges only against those they know are guilty. But nearly 160 death row inmates have been exonerated since the 1970s, and the National Registry of Exonerations, which surely captures only a small fraction of wrongful convictions, runs to more than 1,600 at this point. A study in 1997, sadly the most recent of its kind, found that more than 65,000 inmates in state prisons that year had taken Alford pleas, which involved pleading guilty while maintaining innocence on the grounds that it is simply too risky to go to trial. Of course, not every Alford defendant is innocent, but then not every innocent defendant takes an Alford plea. Clearly, prosecutors do file charges against innocent defendants. The instances that receive media attention tend to be intentionally wrongful, those where the evidence of innocence is overwhelming, but prosecutors storm ahead anyway out of malice or blind ambition. But I bet most wrongful convictions aren't the product of such decisions. Prosecutors generally deal with ambiguous cases. What incentives do they face when acting in good faith to err on the side of safety and file the charges versus erring on the side of caution and dropping the case? Locally elected prosecutors surely do think about innocence, and not just because they don't want a wrongful conviction scandal to derail a re-election campaign, but their aren't many restrictions keeping them from filing charges beyond increasingly weakened trial protections and personal ethics. Prosecution in the United States is a highly local affair. Almost all criminal cases are handled by one of the nation's approximately 2,400 prosecutor offices. And in 46 states, these prosecutors are elected in county-level elections. Whilst prosecutors almost always win their re-election campaigns and often run unopposed, electoral victory isn't guaranteed. Data indicate that prosecutors running for re-election win 95% of the time, but only 69% of the time when facing opposition, although that rate rises to almost 80% in larger districts. And several people have reminded me that prosecutors are political creatures, and thus they are sensitive to electoral pressures, even when victory seems assured. So who applies this pressure? Only a small group. Not many people vote in these elections. In 2013, for example, a bitterly contested primary battle in Kings County, New York, resulted in barely 20% voter turnout. And in the 2020 general election in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, 34% of those who voted simply skipped voting for prosecutor altogether, despite being in the polling booth already. Moreover, those who do vote tend to be wealthier, whiter, and more suburban, while those who are prosecuted are disproportionately poor, minority, I skipped a bit, and urban. Most cities, for example, are parts of bigger counties that include rings of wealthier suburbs. And these suburbs, as local scholar William Stuntz has pointed out, tend to wield disproportionate power when it comes to prosecutor elections, even though crime is concentrated in the cities. Thus, the cost of wrongful convictions are disproportionately borne by the group with less political power, or at least a weaker political voice. Urban minorities are also the biggest beneficiaries of effective crime fighting by prosecutors, which makes their reduced political voice all the more troubling. I'm not saying that this leads prosecutors to willfully go after disproportionately minority urban defendants. Innocence be damned. Although it certainly helps explain why, say, the current response to rising opioid abuse by whites has been more public health orientated than the response was to crack cocaine. But it surely means that when deciding whether to file charges in an uncertain case, prosecutors will be more likely to focus on safety over error, to file rather than dismiss, since the suburban voters want to be safe, but it isn't their families who bear the costs of error. Finally, I think you'll like this one. This is titled, "The Presumption of Innocence Exists in Theory, Not Reality." This article is by none other than Keith Finley. Keith Finley is an assistant professor of law at the University of Wisconsin Law School, where he is co-director of the Wisconsin Innocence Project. He represented Stephen Avery's subject of the Making a Murderer documentary in the proceedings that produced DNA evidence to prove Avery's innocence and exonerate him of a 1985 sexual assault conviction. He wrote, "If, as the Supreme Court has consistently declared, the presumption of innocence is among the most fundamental principles in our criminal justice system, it is also among the most fragile. The presumption is under constant assault from jurors' natural assumption that if someone is arrested and charged with a crime, he or she must have done something wrong. It is also vulnerable to the media frenzy around high-profile cases, the fear-driven politics of crime, the highly punitive nature of our culture and the innate cognitive processes that produce tunnel vision and confirmation bias. Indeed, research suggests that the presumption of innocence exists more in theory than reality. In studies, mock jurors predict a 50% chance of voting to convict before hearing any evidence. Other research shows that while simulated jurors initially assign low probabilities of guilt, they abandon the presumption of innocence promptly as prosecution evidence is introduced. Given these natural inclinations, one would think a system built on the presumption of innocence would protect and reinforce that presumption, but in many ways it does not. Pre-trial bail policies, for example, are not based on assessments of any likelihood of innocence or the need for innocent people to prepare for their defence, but solely on the risk that the presumed guilty accused might not appear for trial. On this score, the presumption of guilt accelerated in the early 1970s when notions of preventative detention, that is, complete denial of bail, emerged as part of the Nixon administration's mission to control criminals before they committed crimes. The presumption of innocence is undermined in practice as well. Police are trained to act on a presumption of guilt in ways that exacerbate natural tendencies toward confirmation bias. Police are trained, for example, to make quick assessments of guilt and to interrogate suspects, not to learn information about the case, but to obtain a confession that confirms their suspicions. It need not be that way. Police in other countries, most notably the United Kingdom, are trained not to interrogate as if they know the answers to their questions. Instead, they embrace investigative interviewing, in which they employ probing, accusatory questions designed to elicit information. Unlike police in the United States, they are not permitted to lie to suspects about evidence to trick them into confessing. And yet this process does not impede their ability to investigate crime. Suspects in the United Kingdom confess at roughly the same rate as suspects in the United States. All of these assaults on the presumption of innocence and the systemic failures to resist them are on vivid display in the Netflix documentary series Making a Murderer, about the murder trials of Stephen Avery and his nephew Brendan Dassey. Regardless of whether Avery and Dassey are actually innocent or guilty, on that question I make no claims here, the series effectively shows how seriously compromised was the presumption of innocence. The public reaction to the case today is 180 degrees from the public's reaction to Avery's arrest in Teresa Halbach's murder in 2005. As much as the public today is horrified by the apparent rush to judgment and questionable tactics used to convict Avery and Dassey, the outrage was aimed squarely at Avery and Dassey at the time of the investigation. Public judgment was swift and vicious. The crime was horrific, and the lust for retribution was palpable. The presumption of innocence had no chance. The outrage led local prosecutor Ken Kratz to hold press conference after press conference in which he and local law enforcement investigators detailed the grisly details of their theory of the crime and the evidence, as if guilt was a given and a trial was unnecessary. It was that mood and the attending media frenzy that made it virtually impossible for Avery and Dassey to get affordable bail or an untainted jury anywhere in the state. The presumption of guilt was on full display. Much can be done to protect the presumption of innocence, starting with enforcing the ethical rules against prejudicial pre-trial publicity, changing the way police interrogate suspects, and recalibrating pre-trial release decisions to allow the innocent to prepare a defence. Following nearly any controversial case will offer many lessons about our criminal system. Perhaps chief among them is the feebleness of the presumption of innocence in our system today, and the need to find ways to reinvigorate that bedrock principle. As I say, 3 very interesting articles. I will leave the links below. As usual, comments always welcome from either side of the fence. We'll catch you again soon. Bye for now.